Plants might look passive and defenseless. Okay, not these plants, but real plants, actual plants that you see in the field. They look defenseless probably because they just sort of sit there, or maybe because from our perspective they just look so very different from us we can't even relate. Maybe it's the problem is that we're just so human focused and we can't really understand their perspective. But there's just going to be a lot that's going on with them that we don't usually see. Maybe not as much as what you see in this video game, but they have a lot going on. Plants have lots and lots of enemies. They include environmental stresses and pollution, like we have to face, but lots of other things that we face as well, including bacteria and viruses, insects, fungi, nematodes, all sorts of different things. They've got to put up with a lot. It's just that typically we don't see them putting up with that unless we look very closely. Today we're going to look at a lot of the things that plants have to put up with and have defenses for. Let's start off with fungi. There are lots of famous fungi that have impacted plants, but many more of them that people haven't heard of. The most famous one in the United States anyway is chestnut blight. Chestnut blight is maybe one that you haven't heard of, but you probably should have. Chestnuts used to be the most common plant in eastern North America, or at least the most common tree. But ever since a fungus was introduced from Asia that demolished the chestnut population throughout eastern North America, chestnuts have been very rare. Blight is a rapid and complete chlorosis or browning and then death of plant tissues. That happens in leaves, branches, twigs, floral organs. It can happen all over the place. Blight is generally a term that represents the plant response. Many diseases that primarily exhibit this symptom are also called blights. So for example, the chestnut blight was a fungus that led to blighting in the leaves or in the stems. This fungus is the main cause of chestnut blight, and it was a devastating disease of the American chestnut tree in the early 1900s. It caused a rapid and widespread die-off of the most plentiful tree in the eastern range. Other kinds of fungal diseases are known as smuts and rusts. There are lots of other kinds too, but these are the most fun to say. And they're also pretty common. Rust, which is a kind of fungus that makes it look like it's got rust on the outside. They're plant diseases caused by the pathogenic fungi of the order Puccinales. That is a group of rust genera, about 168 rust genera and around 7,000 known species, more than half of which belong to the genus Puccinia. Rusts have complicated life cycles that involve the attack of two host plant species, so they will alternate between two different host plants. They can cause all sorts of problems, including lack of growth of the plant, unsightly growths on the plants. It can kill the plants. Smuts are restricted to flowering plants only, whereas rusts can attack ferns and gymnosperms and everything. Rusts attack a lot of different kinds of plants. Smuts only attack flowering plants, and they only attack one species at a time, unlike rusts. Smuts are often dispersed by pollinating insects, so in a sense they are kind of like plant venereal diseases. There have been some famous ethnobotanical consequences of plant fungal pathogens. For example, the Salem witch trials were a result of women who felt a burning sensation, they hallucinated, they supposedly cavorted with the devil, and they were generally thought of as being insane. In 1976, a woman named Linda Caporiel examined the possibility that ergot, which is a fungal disease, might be the culprit. Ergotism is a disease that results from humans consuming a fungus that grows on rye. It looks kind of like overbaked grain, as you see in this picture. So this is a rye seed head, and then that kind of brownish thing that's hanging off of it is the ergot fungus that's growing on top of the seeds or within the seeds. It produces compounds that were later synthesized as LSD, which is a very powerful hallucinogen. On an agricultural level, the growing conditions were right during the 1690s, at the time when there were Salem witches, and ergot was able to grow and do really well. A really wet season in 1691 would have been perfect for ergot to spread on rye plants. So maybe it's coincidental, maybe this is the reason why these women thought that they were actual witches who cavorted with the devil. So plants don't just get fungi, they also get viruses. Now viruses are not really well understood in plants, but there is a couple that are pretty common. Usually viruses are transmitted by insect vectors, so they don't just blow around in the wind like smuts and rusts do. Instead, they get transmitted by insects. Tobacco mosaic virus, TMV, and cauliflower mosaic virus, CAMV, are frequently used in plant molecular biology. One thing that's especially useful for these is that they, for the longest time, had a CAMV 35S promoter, which is a very strong promoter and was most frequently used in molecular transformations to make genetically modified plants. That's because the virus was able to take control of the plant's cellular metabolism and cellular DNA replication system, and humans have since used that application to genetically modify all manner of plants. Phytoplasma are bacterial parasites, and they're a little bit different, but they have some similarities. These are obligate bacterial parasites of plant phloem tissue, so they are isolated only in plant phloem tissue. And insects are vectors for these plant-to-plant transmission of these bacteria. Aster yellows, which you see in the upper left-hand corner, is a chronic systemic plant disease caused by a bacterium-like organism called a phytoplasma. It kind of acts like a virus, but it's also a bacteria. It's kind of complicated. You see these strawberries down in the lower left that have what look like little leaves growing out of them. This plant is also infected by a phytoplasma. And as it's shown in the life cycle of phytoplasma in the lower right-hand corner, this is something that's transmitted by phloem-feeding insects like leafhoppers and plant hoppers. So speaking of bacteria, plants have lots of different kinds of bacteria live on them. I shouldn't say attack them, but live on them. Most of these bacteria are harmless and part of the regular plant's microbiome. They might even be beneficial, sort of like some of the bacteria in our bodies. But a smaller number, around 100 known species, are able to cause plant diseases. Bacterial diseases are much more prevalent in tropical and subtropical regions of the world, not so much in temperate areas like in Alabama. So plants have a lot of things that attack them, but they also have a lot of defenses against those things, those pathogens that attack them. At the leaf level, plants have waxes on the cuticle which protects the cell from the outside. This is a bunch of little images that I got from an awesome PowerPoint presentation from the UK. These waxes are produced on the outside that both shed water and also keep pathogens from being able to invade the plant cellular tissue. Inside the plant cell walls are very strong and very thick, and they typically are able to keep most plant pathogens out. Should the plant pathogen come in, plants are able to have programmed cell death in a manner that allows those cells to die off and stop the spread of the pathogen from within the plant. Because plants are much more modular than humans or animals in general, they're able to shut down the spread of disease through basically killing off tissue. They could senesce leaves and drop those leaves off, or at a cellular level they could just kill off select cells, which should then also kill off the pathogen that's within those cells. Finally, plants are able to produce a whole bunch of substances that kill viruses, bacteria, etc. inside the cells. So many of the plant defense compounds that we're going to talk about later and that we've talked about in other parts of the class may be protective compounds or defensive compounds that also are effective against pathogens and not just herbivores. But let's talk a little bit about those herbivores. There's a wide variety of different herbivores that consume plant tissue, and as you recall from evolutionary ecology, all those kinds of organisms that are featured in these pictures are very important and have a very negative impact on plant tissues. We can talk about those from a few different perspectives. There are grazers on the right, which eat grasses and other plants at the ground level. And then there's another category of herbivores that are called browsers that eat foliage that is higher up and off the ground. Now grazers and browsers are typically terms referred to terrestrial based or land-based herbivores. So typically we use this to refer to big mammals that may either be grazers or browsers. But plants don't just have vegetative tissues, as you remember, they also have seeds and fruits. Generally, if an animal eats the whole fruit, like these guys on the left, then they are known as frugivores. And they are typically plant mutualists because they will eat the whole fruit, which is a bribe that allows the plant to convince a frugivore to eat the whole fruit and then poop the seeds out somewhere else intact and dispersed away from mom. On the other hand, those two examples on the right are examples of granivores. Those granivores are more like predators because they kill young embryos in consuming the seeds, either the grains, like of grasses, or of nuts, like acorns. Either way, they're still thought of as being granivores, even though they're not solely eating grains. Now, the ecological effects of herbivores are pretty substantial. They can affect the fitness or the reproductive ability of plants, the survival rates of plants. They can impact the survival of offspring directly as seed predators or by slowing the growth of the parental plant and keeping it susceptible to other herbivores. Herbivores have the ability to control plant distributions and abundance, so where they occur and how many they are. And because of alterations of plant distribution patterns and relative abundances, they can also alter plant community structure and composition. Herbivores can have a huge impact on the plants that they are consuming, as well as all the other members of those communities that plants are influencing. Typically, the effects of herbivores that they have on plants depend on the degree of feeding specialization. So if they're very, very specialized, these herbivores can have a massive impact. If they're relatively generalized and eat lots of different things, their impact usually isn't quite as large. Here's an example of a generalist that can have a pretty big impact. Cows that are grown by humans and restrained within certain areas can have a huge impact on the native flora and subsequently on the fauna, because the animals that are there, are also impacted by the presence of these plants. As you can see on the right, this is the place where the cattle were grazing. On the left is what the plant community would look like if there were no cattle around. Those were pretty large herbivores, but even really small herbivores like these pine beetles can have a huge, huge impact. These pine bark beetles are about half the size of a grain of rice. Yet they can overwhelm pine tree defenses and kill massive stands of pines all at once, which is what you see here in this kind of orangish amoeba-looking formation in the picture on the right. They do that by weaving galleries underneath the bark and the vascular cambium, which effectively girdles the tree. You can see this in the upper right. These are all these different girdles, or these different pathways that the beetles have made in their galleries. They will burrow through this plant tissue, and as they're burrowing through, they're laying eggs, and their larvae then come out and hatch. As their larvae hatch and the adults are moving around, they're cutting off basically the phloem of the plant, and then the plant ends up not being able to move products of photosynthesis around, essentially starving the tree. Pine trees have some defenses against this because they have this resinous sap that they push out, but if there's too many beetles, they overwhelm the plant's defenses and they can't survive. This has a pretty big impact on people because these standing dead pine forests can then be highly, highly susceptible to massive and catastrophic fires. Sometimes individual insects or species of insects can be really useful as a means of biocontrol, which is a way of diminishing unwanted plants by using another live species to control that plant. This particular invasive species is cactus, the same Opuntia cactus that we've got growing around here. And whereas kudzu is really problematic here, cactus used to be really problematic in Australia. They have no native cacti in Australia. The cactus was spread to Australia intentionally, and then it ended up accidentally taking over the native forests and rangelands. One of the most effective examples of biocontrol ever, this cactus moth on the right, was introduced, and as you can see in the photo on the right, it totally wiped out the cactus. you can see from this photo that this is the exact same location taken before and after. So this insect was able to just wipe out cacti. Unfortunately, there are downsides of this too. Now, this cactus moth was native to South America. It got spread over to Australia, and then once it's successfully established in Australia in the early 1920s, it accidentally then was spread to South Africa, to Mauritius, to the Caribbean islands, to Hawaii, and eventually to the mainland United States. Now the problem with that is all of these other areas have native cacti. This is a cactus consuming insect that a lot of the native cacti have no defenses against, and so it is now spreading throughout much of the United States. If you look around outside, especially these days, you'll find that in most places the world is pretty green. In the late 1950s, several ecologists wondered why this was so. This is a very fundamental and basic question, but if you think of it, look around and see all this leaf tissue. This should all be edible. This should all be food for insects or other herbivores. Why isn't it being consumed? In other words, why is the world green? There's all this food out there, but it's being unconsumed. This led to a bunch of research, and people basically settled on a couple of different things for why herbivores are not consuming all the plant tissue. And those two answers both involve some form of trophic interactions. First of all, maybe the predators and parasites of those herbivores are keeping them in check. And secondly, this drew attention to the fact that, hey, maybe some of these plants have defenses or are able to defend themselves. So why is the world green? The first explanation is because of trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is when the enemy of your enemy is actually your friend. So for example, we have this plant which is being consumed by an herbivore, but the predator also eats the herbivore. So if the herbivore is consumed by the predator, then the predator actually is beneficial to the plant. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So another reason why plants are green and thriving and do well is because they actually fight back. Plants have defenses against these herbivores, just like they've got lots of defenses against pathogens. These defenses can come in lots of different forms. They can be mechanical, phenological, hormonal, biotic, and biochemical. Let's talk about these in order. The first one is mechanical defenses. Typically, these can be broken down into external and internal mechanical defenses. Let's talk about the external ones first. So these things include properties like leaf toughness, spiny leaf margins, thorns and spines, really hard tissues like you see in the bamboo, all sorts of these physical defenses that keep other things from being able to consume these plant tissues. There's also tolerance, which is the ability of a plant to regrow after being eaten, just like these grasses in the African Serengeti. Also on the outside of plants are these things called trichomes. Trichomes are little hairs that project above the surface of the leaves. They may be glandular, like in these tomatoes, with little glands on the tips that release these oils that are smelly, potentially deterrent. They may be stellate or take on any number of different shapes. Incidentally, Quercus stellata, a plant that we learn in lab, has little stellate or star-shaped trichomes like these. Or they may be stinging trichomes, trichomes that contain chemicals that are defensive and urticating, and they are painful, and they are contained in these little trichomes that break off when they become embedded in the mouth parts of or the body parts of an herbivore. There are also internal mechanical defenses. These internal mechanical defenses are because of structures which are non-chemical that deter herbivores, as well as external mechanical defenses do. Rhaphides, seen in the lower right, are needle-shaped crystals of calcium oxalate. These rhaphides are found in more than 200 different families of plants. This one example is from a plant called dumb cane, which is also known as mother-in-law's tongue. These rhaphides don't make a plant inedible and they don't kill you, but when they embed in your tongue and your throat, they make it hard to talk, and you can't talk very straight because your tongue gets really numb and swollen up. The same thing would happen if a herbivore would consume that plant. Druze crystals are usually globular or star-shaped, and they are also calcium oxalate crystals. There's also silica inside of grass leaves, and this silica wears down the teeth of herbivores, and it makes it difficult for them to consume large amounts of that plant. And then, of course, there's internal toughness of the primary cell wall because of overlapping cellulose strands inside the cells. Incidentally, going back to these calcium oxalate crystals, oxalis, a plant that we've seen in lab, has a sharp, sour taste because of oxalic acid. If you have too much of that oxalic acid, it can precipitate and give you kidney stones, which are, incidentally, calcium oxalate. So very similar to these Druze crystals and rhaphides.